Control flowed through wagons, not weapons. Without the annona, grain, oil, wine, and salt, no campaign could proceed. The army's stomach was Rome's leash, stretching from African granaries to Alpine feed stores. Every legion from Syria to Hispania depended on this fragile thread. But if a river flooded or a harvest in Narbonensis failed, men grew restless. Supply crises turned towns into enemies. Allied cities accused of hoarding grain often suffered collective punishment. Rations ran thin and discipline frayed. A general no longer measured progress in territory taken, but in days before mutiny. Rome never fought alone. Marching with the legions were the auxilia, archers from Crete, cavalry from Thrace, slingers from the Balearics, non-citizen units bound not by Roman blood but by treaty or promise. They brought expertise in terrain and tactics Romans seldom mastered, yet they came with risk. Loyalty to Rome did not mean loyalty in battle. Some auxiliaries vanished in the night, crossing back to tribal kin. Others demanded loot over discipline. In forests or mountain passes where legionary order decayed, it was these men, half-trusted, half-indispensable, who turned uncertain campaigns into desperate improvisation. Order, however, marched with the camp. Every castra, even on enemy soil, mirrored Roman precision. Trenches, ramparts, tents in strict formation. Soldiers followed routine not for convenience but for control. Under canvas, a centurion's tent was placed with the intention of law. But in winter quarters on the Rhine or under rain-thick clouds of Britannia, boredom bred insolence. Dice rang over firelight. Petty theft turned to knifings. Without battle, hierarchy soured into resentment. And always present, the lictor's rod, silent but immediate. Even with planning, terrain could not be reasoned with. The Roman legion thrived in open plains where formation and timing turned iron into empire. But in the canopies of Germania or the ridges of the Balkans, the world closed in. Trees stifled visibility, ambushes silenced drums and shattered cohesion. It was not uncommon for auxiliaries to whisper warnings a day late, or for mistaken roads to feed entire legions into dead valleys. One miscalculation in these enclosed campaigns could mean thousands dead, standards lost, and years of prestige erased in a single forest hour. Victory, of course, was supposed to justify the cost. Yet many campaigns were launched with profit, not patriotism, in mind. Loot from temples, captives from hill forts, and procurement contracts for Roman equites formed the backbone of military funding. A general promised gain or his men would not march. When glory lagged behind, gold soldiers demanded their share up front. Promissory donatives replaced discipline. Campaigns faltered when eastern plunder seemed too distant or when local towns proved barren. Greed was not a vice but a variable, one which generals ignored at their peril. Across the empire, parchment maps cracked along creases, their relevance aging between seasons. New roads were carved where none had existed months before enemy settlements moved or vanished. Scouts returned with half-truths, merchants exaggerated for protection. Yet over this imperfect knowledge, Roman generals stretched power, betting that efficiency could tame uncertainty. A misdrawn tributary could reroute an entire march. A mislabeled tribe could spark unexpected resistance. And still the orders came, from Rome or from necessity. To delay was to appear timid, but to charge forward blind was to risk disaster. With every campaign, Rome tried to redraw the world. But already, across the Danube, in the dust beyond the Tigris, some boundaries would not hold. The map grew darker as the path ahead brightened with fire. In the year 66 BCE, as Lucullus waged his cautious advance against Mithridates in Pontus, the Forum Romanum overflowed, not with soldiers but with voices. Senators argued beneath the carved shadows of old triumphal arches, weighing distant thunderheads in the east against mutterings from the north. Even the most seasoned general, cloaked in imperium and escorted by lictors, never marched alone. Every military movement unfolded under senatorial surveillance, its legality shaped in the curia, its legitimacy underwritten by the Senate's favor. Campaigns did not begin merely in the field, but months earlier in the city's marble corridors. A consul or promagistrate might petition to extend his command, citing threats to provinces already pacified under his name. Yet these requests never found a neutral court. The Senate, ever wary of overmighty generals, granted prorogations sparingly, balancing military need against political rivalries. One man's triumph could be another's exile, and Latin maps inked in Rome might quietly erase the names of enemies back home. Even Gaius Julius Caesar, already consular and proconsul in Gaul, navigated this political terrain as carefully as any Alpine pass. Though his imperium militiae sanctioned him for war auctoritas, the intangible weight of reputation and Senate endorsement was the currency that sustained his legions. A vote lost in Rome, a crisis in Syria, or a grain dispute in Egypt could leach moral standing from a general hundreds of miles distant. And if news moved slower, then armies' rumor moved faster still. One senatorial whisper could unmake a year's careful diplomacy. The Senate had good reason to fixate eastward. Since Sulla's day, the volatile frontiers of Asia Minor and the ambitions of Parthian kings had drawn Rome's gaze. Eastern provinces, Cilicia, Cappadocia, Syria, were rich in taxes and vital to the grain supply chain. A single failed shipment from Alexandria could send prices soaring, and the Subura stir riot among the urban poor and provoke consular scrutiny of Western commands once thought autonomous. As the senatorial calendar, filled with debates over Egyptian treaty revisions and propraetorial misconduct in Antioch, provincial generals in Gaul simply waited for orders for grain for silence. This slowness became a weapon. Political allies could delay decrees necessary for reinforcements or claim emergency mandates for other fronts, draining a general's manpower in the guise of pragmatism. Legates dispatched to renew supply drafts might return empty-handed or not at all. Should a tribune veto the Senate's decision on provincial funding, entire campaigns could stall. Commanders learned to campaign not just against foreign enemies, but to lobby factions of the optimates and manipulate nobles at home. War required not only swords but votes. The consequences were more than political. When T. Labienus deserted Caesar's side in early 49 BCE, it was not simple betrayal, but a sign of tectonic shifting within Roman alignments. Labienus, once Caesar's trusted legate, had sensed the cooling of support in Rome and recalibrated his loyalties toward Pompey. Personal allegiance often walked hand in hand with senatorial sentiment. If the Senate turned, so too might the men. A general could not hold the Rhine if the Forum disavowed the bridge. Meanwhile, Eastern generals, such as Pompey, thrived when the Senate's attention dwelled where their banners advanced. His sweeping victories against pirates and in the Levant bore not just military spoils, but a carefully cultivated image of Roman order extended eastward. He returned with maps redrawn and provinces reorganized, with the air of a man whose commands defined Senate decree not followed. This disturbed balance deeply. The Republic's core ideal, that the Senate retained supremacy over even the most glorious success, was under slow siege. And yet senators persisted in their oversight, issuing instructions and dispatching fact-finding missions, composed of beneficiarii consularis minor magistrates, or even equestrian appointees. These political envoys monitored grain stocks, troop discipline, and local levies, returning months later with scrolls that outlined more than military facts. They carried the Senate's judgment and the governor's faith. As the cold Gaulish campaigns dragged into another winter, Caesar counted more than enemies. He counted debts to publicani creditors, letters unopened from Rome, and the increasingly uneasy silence of those who once cheered his early campaigns. None of this was visible from the forward palisades of a legion xiv castrum, but a general did not need to see Rome to feel it watching. In the East, victories bred statues. In Gaul, delay bred doubt. And with the Parthians bristling at Euphrates crossings and grain riots stirring in the Transtiberum, the Senate's gaze lingered eastward, leaving the western frontier unsteady, and its commanders increasingly adrift in imperial ambition without republican security. Whether in stone halls or snowbound fields, each step now risked unraveling more than a campaign. In the Roman World War began not with a charge but with calculation. No campaign could stir until the grain stirred first. Rome's logistics, broadly termed the annona, were as essential as iron and far heavier to bear. Behind every legion wheeling into Gaul or crossing the Euphrates trailed carts of barley, amphorae of oil, hogsheads of wine, barrels of salt. Grain itself moved in weighted convoys under guard mile by mile from Horea in coastal depots to the mouths of hungry men. It was a supply chain defined less by ambition than necessity. Without it, Rome's famed discipline withered. This burden had grown since the Republic hardened into institution by the Principate. In the age of Augustus, and after the Annona Militaris supplied a standing army, not only garrisoning static frontiers, but mobilizing into volatile zones across 3 continents. It was a system at once powerful and brittle. Grain could move swiftly along the Po or the Rhone where river traffic multiplied Rome's reach. But goods overland, by ox cart or mule, crawled at the pace of geography. On soft ground or broken roads, 30 kilometers a day became 10. In hostile lands, travel slowed to the risk of armed escort. A general even gifted with imperium could do little without knowing the location of the next granary, or whether the governor of a province had fulfilled his requisition. Warfare demanded not glory but arithmetic. 10,000 troops consumed over 60 modii of wheat daily, not counting fodder for horses or the soldiers, ration of acetum and dried legumes. Wine was not luxury. It replaced bacteria-ridden water. Salt staved off rot in meat and brine-slicked olives. One missed shipment and latrines, overflowed tempers, frayed blades whispered in the dark. And so a campaign could falter before the first javelin flew. Flooded roads in Illyricum, an early frost in Aquitania, or spoiled grain in transit could halt an entire force. Some commanders stockpiled rations from municipia months in advance, stationing wagons beneath canvas and guards outside the gates. But local harvests meant local politics. When the grain failed, blame traveled faster than carts. Roman soldiers, many recruited from distant provinces ignorant of local custom, could turn surly and violent. Entire allied towns in Hispania or Thrace were razed not for treason, but for missing their quotas. Resentment festered along these routes. Procurators tasked with collecting and delivering grain by imperial decree were often resented more deeply than barbarian cavalry. In Cappadocia, officials faced ambush not from kings but from fed-up villagers. And for the legions dependent on these lines, starvation bred mutiny more reliably than lost battle. 1 month of spoiled supplies and soldiers, once loyal, cursed their general's name by firelight. The weight of Annona was not measured only in tons but in morale. Campaigning across Armenia or deep into Mauritania, generals knew that the troops' trust ebbed with every skipped meal or reduced ration. Without it, discipline dissolved. Even elite units, legions that had marched under Augustus or Trajan, could break upon the empty promise of wheat. But with precise planning, Annona became weapon. A force well fed could move swiftly, threaten rebellion behind enemy lines, and carve through the countryside while locals withered from seized stores. Caesar made war this way in Gaul, depriving tribes of their harvests while supplying his men from pre-cleared caches. Logistics was not only survival, it was domination. Yet efficiency carried its own risk dependency. As emperors centralized grain distribution under imperial agents, generals lost initiative. They awaited instructions from Rome, delayed by winter seas or silt-choked ports. In Pannonia, delays meant stasis. In Judea, they meant revolt. Legionaries hungry and idle demanded action, while their commanders put off battle for bread. Even in moments of strategy, Annona interfered. Armies could only campaign certain seasons, not just from climate but from crop cycles. By late autumn, pack animals weakened, rivers froze, villages emptied of surplus. Food could not be found where it had just been taken. A triumphal campaign in spring might become a death march by winter's bite. As supplies tightened, so did tempers. In distant provinces, Roman officers sometimes requisitioned by force, pushing neutral villages into rebellion. In turn, these disruptions cut lines further, a deadly loop. When discipline buckled under hunger, legions no longer advanced, they marauded. Even well-ordered castra turned savage by the scent of baking bread from a closed gate. The burden of the annona never lessened. It simply shifted. A general with 15,000 men might win a siege yet be undone by rotting oil or delayed wine. Navigation of terrain, loyalty of hosts, and timeliness of shipments mattered more than tactics alone. Rome's expansion had ensured that fate came not just upon the sword but by the amphora. And as the empire grew more fragile, so did this lifeline. Future enemies would not need to break a line in battle. They would only need to cut the grain road, watch the wagons burn, and wait. They came in droves from the hills of Illyricum, the deserts of Numidia, the thick pine forests beyond the Danube. Archers from Crete, slingers from the Balearics cavalry, raised from Iberian tribes once branded rebels. These were Rome's auxilia, non-citizen warriors bound not by civic oath, but by treaty coin, and often the promise of recognition. For every 2 legionaries, there might be 3 auxiliaries. And for a Roman general charting a campaign in strange terrain, these unpredictable allies formed both his shield and his spear. Unlike the legionaries, sworn through sacramentum, sharpened by drilled into the rhythms of Roman command, auxiliaries fought in their own traditions. Cavalry might dismount at the wrong time, infantry might rush before the signal. Orders in Latin were heard through accents thick with eastern syllables or northern consonants. A Roman tribune might try to command a Sarmatian horseman with hand signals, only to find himself mimicked, not obeyed. And all the while eyes watched for loot before they watched for banners. Still, Rome relied on them. A legion alone could rarely hold extended lines. Auxiliaries scouted ahead, manned outposts, forded rivers first, and died first in ambushes. They fought in woods where Roman formations collapsed, and they rode unarmored into hills where legionaries feared entrapment. Without auxilia, the imperial frontier could not function. Rome's enemies knew this too, and so whispered to them. Defections, rare but devastating, took place not only in siege or rout, but even mid-battle. In Britain, desertions broke routing flanks. On the eastern frontier, mounted archers switched sides and turned their bows ambidextrously against Roman lines. The loss of one cohort of Numidian riders might unhinge a wider strategy that relied on their speed and loyalty. For every Roman road set in stone, there lay a human uncertainty in the saddle of an auxiliary horseman. Their integration was planned but improvisational. Most were organized into cohorts or elite cohort and cavalry wings, with Roman officers tasked to impose discipline, sometimes effectively, sometimes not at all. Languages collided in the castra orders, mistranslated rumors, misheard commands, misunderstood. Even the rhythmic clang of morning drills varied from one auxiliary contingent to another. The effort to standardize such a varied instrument tested generals far from home and far from precedent. Spoils for many auxiliaries weren't bonuses, they were expected. While legionaries often accepted delay in payment, auxilia demanded tangible reward. Entire groups refused to march unless granted shares of loot from previously captured towns. In some cases, auxiliary contingents burned granaries or temples not from malice, but from unfamiliarity with Roman restraint. In others, they took captives from friendly tribes if local customs differed from their own. To the Senate, these were crimes; to the auxiliary, mere ritual or rite. Discipline collided with custom, and the line between friend and foreigner blurred. The general's solution was usually Romanization. Over time, select auxiliary units were granted citizenship, a reward not only for loyalty, but as a tool of control. A retired soldier became a civis Romanus, his children eligible for the full rights of empire. But this system too carried risk. As auxiliaries became Roman, they often grew resentful of being treated as less than. Resentment bred rigidity, and officers who failed to navigate these shifting loyalties risked fracture. The smell of sweat and horse leather haunted auxiliary camps. Songs were sung in languages without Latin equivalents. Tribal standards hung beside Roman eagles not beneath them. And while some units carried themselves with the stoic obedience Rome demanded, others remained as mercurial as the river fog that shrouded the Rhine. Loyalty was measured in terms not just of coin, but recognition of honor. And when denied, the sword might turn. Campaign plans therefore adjusted not just for terrain or enemy movement, but for auxiliary behavior. Commanders learned which contingents could be trusted in siege, which excelled in open field, and which were prone to vanish if the enemy sued for alliance. Like the winds around a coastal promontory, they were known but not tamed. And even when they stayed, their post-battle expectations could upset an entire province. Grain enough had to be secured for all. Prisoners had to be divided with care. One slight to the wrong chieftain and years of diplomacy could unravel overnight. By the early 3rd century, a new pattern emerged. Many generals themselves arose from the ranks of provincial or auxiliary families. What had been foreign was now rising to command. The auxilia had shaped the Roman war machine, and now increasingly shaped its leadership. But as the distinctions between Roman and non-Roman faded on paper, they flared still in resentment and ambition on the field. Ahead lay a different danger. When legions failed and auxiliaries hesitated, would Rome still know whose loyalty could be counted on, and at what cost? The borders were long, the roads fading, and the trust that once held empire together was beginning to bend under the weight of unfamiliar banners. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman generals commanding abroad understood that authority began not on the battlefield, but with the line etched in earth outside a legion's tent. The castra camp was not merely shelter. It was architecture as discipline, a ritual of order repeated across climates and campaigns. Whether pitched on the Gallic plain or near the Danube floodwaters, its rectangular grid spoke with the same iron certainty: all men had a place, and no one stood outside the pattern. The process began before the spade struck soil. Once a general chose ground, usually elevated near fresh water and with clear lines of retreat, surveyors raised a white flag at the center. This marked the praetorium, the general's command post, bounded precisely 100 Roman feet from the flag, in every direction forming a central square of 40 square feet. From there, soldiers erected the rest of the camp with mathematical symmetry. Streets extended like spokes from the center, assigning each cohort its standard location. Tents fell into neat rows, each aligned by rank, first the senior officers, then centurions down to the milits gregara, the common soldiers. But order bred as much resentment as resilience. Within this crucible of control, soldiers lived bound to schedule and punishment as much as to sword and shield. Trumpet calls marked the day, one for guard changes, another for drills, another at dusk for the signum receptui, calling men back behind the palisade. Even sleep was structured. Night watches divided into 4 shifts vigiliae, demanding rotations of alert sentries. A failure here, and the entire unit could be decimated. 1 man in 10 executed by lot. Still, no palisade held back winter's boredom. In frostbitten provinces like Germania Superior or Britain, where rivers froze and patrols dwindled, the daily grind dulled into stagnation. There, around smoky oil lamps and under sodden hide tents, discipline thinned. Soldiers rolled knucklebones, gambled their stipends away on dice games like Alia, or swapped rumors drawn from traitors, scouts, and drunk centurions. Talk of bonuses owed of the general's favoritism of death unpaid for in land or gold. Such speech festered. In one winter camp on the Lower Rhine, a unit of auxilia was accused of plotting desertion after weeks without resupply from the Annona. The lictors, military enforcers tied by custom to command, reminded the men wordlessly of Rome's cold authority. They carried the fasces rods bound around an axe, the symbol of imperium and its severest rites. In civil Rome, the axe was removed to signify restraint. In camp, it remained. A blow for insubordination, shackles for theft, crucifixion for desertion. Punishments could be unleashed without trial ratified by the centurion or by a general exercising imperium militiae. Yet even that power rubbed raw against growing discontent in remote outposts. As the Republic waned and emperors rose from the army itself, the commander's stern hand had to balance control with charisma. A misstep could turn discipline into an excuse for revolt. Not all disobedience came from malice. After years in service, often 20 or more, veterans expected premia land grants or money promised by Senate decree or princeps edict. Delays, often caused by corrupt officials or budgetary shortages, left aging soldiers angry and idle. Some took their grievances not to their tribunes, but directly to the general, or worse, to the ears of a provincial governor sympathetic to mutiny. Camp discipline did not prevent insurrection. It only delayed the moment when complaint passed into act. Even camaraderie essential to morale carried double edges. Tentmates contubernales bonded in firelight, 10 men per tent, sharing meals, tasks, and guard duty. But in close quarters, grievance spread faster than command. A jest about Caesar's competency, a rumor of lost pay in Africa, a discovered affair with a provincial girl. Such sparks leapt quickly from casual talk into coordinated grievance. If no grain came, if drilling felt pointless, or the general grew distant, the fire of camaraderie could become a furnace of sedition. Against all this, generals relied on spectacle, parades, sacrificia, mock battles, all designed to reinforce Roman identity and remind legionaries of a shared mission. But as armies pushed past the limits of the known world into the moss-choked forests of Germania or the salt-lashed peaks of Armenia, the unity forged in the Castra walls struggled against the entropy of time, weather, and isolation. A Roman camp was more than lines and tents. It was a fortress of routine pressed against an untamed world. But each time the sun set beyond the palisade, and the cold silence returned, the general knew inside his perfect grid men still dreamed of revolt. In Germania's northeast, where the Tiber's reach thinned and Roman maps turned vague, the forest spoke first. Above a canopy so dense that sunlight fractured into thin spears, below the soil turned to rot, and movement sounded not in marching columns, but in sudden rattles, wild branches snapping under unseen feet. Legionaries advanced with engineered discipline, 12 to a contubernium arrayed by cohort and century, but the silence encircling them was not of awe, it was warning. Roman legions were built for the margins of empire, flat ground, open fields, visible enemies. Formations designed for frontal shock, shield walls locking into testudinis pila, hurled in tight intervals, cavalry screening the flanks. This machine of conquest faltered when it met terrain designed not by surveyors, but by resistance. Germanic tribes, unarmored and unnumbered, dissolved into trees where line of sight failed and formation broke under branches. In such spaces, time turned against Rome and command became guesswork shaped by rumor, not report. Publius Quinctilius Varus deployed 3 legions, XVII, XVIII, and XIX, into the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE, unaware that the terrain itself had been weaponized. The local prince Arminius, trained in Roman tactics and fluent in strategy, had misled Varus with false appeals of a rebellion needing suppression. What began as a routine march swelled into a cauldron of delayed movement and collapsing trust. At first, the line stretched thin to navigate narrow paths, then cavalry was separated, and supply mules entangled in bog trails. Rain, dense and unrelenting, masked the sound of movement deeper in the woods. The smell of wet leather and churned earth signaled not order, but a column unraveling by inches. Roman doctrine placed immense faith in the castra, fortified nightly camps, but in the forest no ground offered symmetry or spacing for a standard quadrangular encampment. Trenches faltered. Palisades could not be constructed quickly. Orders shouted lost their path in the echoing canopy. Control devolved into isolation, each cohort fought with little knowledge of where the others stood. Varus, removed from his forward units by miles of snaking trail and thickened undergrowth, sent messages by rider. Some made it, most did not return. The Cherusci and their allies chose their moment when Rome's order was most brittle. They struck not from the front but from all sides, crashing down in bursts of noise and spear throwing from cover. Archers fired unseen. Cavalry hidden in groves to the rear flanked the column with speed no Roman formation could match in that terrain. The lines bent then broke. The Roman legate tried to reassert order, drawing men into tight defensive squares, but shields locked shoulder to shoulder wavered when the ground itself gave way. Muck pulling men down logs, blocking retreat. Even centurions could not hold morale against unseen enemies and disintegrating cohesion. Varus, wounded and encircled, chose suicide over capture. His men followed, many falling not to blades, but to exhaustion, starvation, and ground that offered no sanctuary. 3 whole legions perished in Teutoburg, an estimated 15,000, 20 soldiers, auxiliaries, animal handlers, engineers. Eagle standards, symbolic anchors of Rome's martial presence, were lost, a sacrilege not seen since Crassus fell at Carrhae. For years Rome refused publicly to assign new legions. The disgraced numbers XVII, XVII, XIX vanished from military records. Augustus himself, upon hearing the news, reportedly struck his head against a wall, crying for Varus to return the legions. Whether history records his words or only the grief they represent, the loss was unmistakably real. The defeat redefined campaign planning north of the Rhine. By terrain, if not numbers, Germania would remain unconquered. Generals studied not only their enemies, but the land itself. Climate, forest density, bog depth, even seasonal pollen. Anything to calibrate movement to safety. Scouts were redoubled, selected not from conscript lists, but from veteran auxilia experienced in Sardinia, Illyria, or Pannonia. But even trust in guides now bore caution. Arminius had been a trusted ally before he led Rome into the trees. Legions henceforth carved their roads as they advanced, felling trees in slow miles per day, constructing temporary bridges, where streams cut across valleys, turning war into architecture before battle could even begin. They moved with engineers embedded in command and rear echelons tasked with fortifying each day's gains. The margin for misreading the land had vanished, yet the woods still stood, dense, unchanged, silent to the unwelcome. And Rome, master of law and legion, would forever march beneath branches not entirely its own. Beyond the Rhine, the frontier held more than enemies. It carried visions of future defeats still hidden in the undergrowth waiting. Before Roman swords clashed on foreign soil, ledgers and contracts were signed in the marble shadows of the Forum. Campaigns were calculations, not just conquests, structured around logistics, informed by politics, and bankrolled by Rome's equites, the class of wealthy horse-owning merchants. These financiers, drawn from the Ordo Equestre, advanced large sums for arms, animals, and ships, gambling on repayment in the form of plunder, land allotments, or lucrative state contracts to manage captured tax districts. When legions marched east or north, they did so with parchment as much as pilum. By the 1st century BCE, the alignment of coin and command had become explicit. A general such as Lucullus, campaigning deep into Armenia and Pontus, owed his ability to sustain operations not merely to senatorial backing, but to the silent capital of Roman creditors whose fortunes rode on victory. The legions were his sword, but the purse lay elsewhere. Inside the marching column, discipline was tight, but motivations varied. For veterans, men who had already served for 15 or 20 campaigns, their loyalty was transactional. Promise land or donativa or lose their fervor. 1 denarius per day fed obedience, but only loot stoked momentum. When a march stalled on the Armenian plateau or the Rhenish frontier, centurions counted not morale but back pay. Predictably, generals facing soft resistance began delaying battle not to save men, but but to extract greater wealth from the field, ensuring every city was stripped clean, every corpse looted, and every captive branded for sale. The practice bred corruption. In the late Republic Gaius, Verres notoriously embezzled art and treasure while governing Sicily, citing his past military service as justification. Local auxilia recruited for regional knowledge were directed not toward reconnaissance, but toward storehouses and treasuries, which were often seized under loosely fabricated pretenses of tax delinquency. Peaceful towns could be labeled rebellious with a stroke of the stylus, just enough to justify pillaging under Roman law. But the influx of riches, once a sign of triumph, became a poison. By 50 BCE, soldiers followed generals less out of civic loyalty than personal stake. Julius Caesar, on the eve of his Gallic victories, distributed coins straight to his men, a down payment on the victories to come. Spoils weren't postscript, they were the price of participation. When armies demanded bounty before battle, commanders obliged or risked paralysis. In this climate, imperium took on a grim face. Roman law gave generals supreme command outside the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome. But within the camp walls, they answered not to the res publica, but to their men's expectations. A legion of 400-800 men could collapse overnight if denied promised rewards. On one occasion in Hispania, a general's refusal to distribute plunder led soldiers to torch their own supply wagons, forcing their commander to either pay up or retreat. The sounds of such a camp could betray the shift: fewer marching feet, and more dice tumbling across wooden boards, gold brokers from provinces whispering side deals in Punic or Greek, the sudden silence when a payment caravan arrived late. Cash flow was command. A general with coffers empty risked more than defeat. He risked desertion. Even Rome's ideological justifications for war, security, revenge, divine sanction, grew secondary to pecunia. Senatus Consultum authorized conflict, but it was the grain merchant or arms supplier who ensured 10,000 men could eat and fight for 60 days. The spoils of war no longer followed triumph, they preceded it. A city's resistance might save its soul, but seal its vaults for Roman claim. In quieter moments atop windy passes, or beside firelit rivers, a senior tribune might whisper doubts. What were they serving now? Rome, or the debt notes of a financier back in Capua? The shift did not go unnoticed. As the Republic stumbled into civil war, and the Principate took form, emperors inherited not armies but expectations. By the time Augustus formalized the aerarium militare, the military treasury, the state itself acknowledged the truth: promises cost coin, and coin ruled the march. No general, however gifted, could lead an unpaid force into the unknown. Beyond the Tigris, the Rhine, or the snows of Noricum, legions awaited coin before command. And somewhere ahead, whether in the shadows of a tribal woodland or the columns of a temple town, the final decision to fight or retreat hinged not on omens, but on whether the strongboxes were full. Behind them, the Senate watched, but before them, gold gleamed brighter than glory. And though Rome still raised its standards to the gods before each battle, in the silence afterward, the victor's share often determined the next campaign. Not strategy, nor honor, nor Rome. When Augustus died in the summer of 14 CE, the empire left behind was immense but brittle. Its edges held by oath more than stone, its cohesion stretched across language, loyalty, and long marches. Nowhere was that strain more immediate than on the frigid banks of the lower Rhine, where the legions of Germania Inferior, stationed at Vetera and Ariuberum, sat atop forts more isolated than connected, far from Italian law, but nearer to the forests of unsubdued tribes. Their commander Germanicus, barely 30, inherited not only Augustus's untested directives, but armies laden with veteran grievances. The military calendar had frozen with imperial time. Augustus' final reforms had extended the soldier's term from 16 to 20 years. Many now served into old age, denied land, wives, or citizen sons. Promised donativa, a veteran bonus often given at an emperor's death, had not arrived. The legions who endured sleet in the tents of winter castra demanded clarity. No command, no rank, no ancestral name could mask hunger, frostbite, or the weight of exhausted decades. Here Imperium meant less than shared mud. Word spread. 8 legions across the Rhine frontier knew the moment the princeps was dead, and Tiberius had not yet arrived. The mutiny began not with swords, but with silence. Soldiers refused formation. Tribunes were driven from camps, centurions, symbols of discipline, were dragged from tents by their own men, scourged with their vine staffs, and hurled into the Rhine. The legions presented demands: discharge for the elderly, immediate payment for all, and fixed-term limits. What followed was not an uprising in the name of a rival prince, but the assertion of identity. Rome's soldiers no longer as instruments of the state, but as a power unto themselves. The maps used in war planning had boundaries labeling forests and rivers, but no symbol captured the invisible tipping point, when men ceased to march as Romans and began to speak as a class. Germanicus, blood of the imperial house and general by inheritance and acclaim, stood at a crossroads with no narrow path. He could not abandon the Rhine without endangering all Gaul, yet to crush the rebels risked civil war so soon after Augustus' funeral. He acted with calculation. Opening his tent flaps to the mutineers, he did not summon lictors or cite Senate decrees. Instead, he offered his son, barely past infancy, wrapped in a cloak, as if to say, kill us all or serve again. Shock and shame swept the soldiers momentarily. Emotion stirred, but loyalty had not yet returned. The Praetorian signifers wavered. Then came false mercy. Germanicus, deciding that delay was decay, staged a purge. Quiet executions removed the most defiant. To the loyalists, he distributed coin from his own treasury, symbolic donativa masquerading as imperial generosity. But beneath the deception lay a truth. Even Augustus had feared. Maintaining military obedience required not merely command, but careful theater. For all Rome's strength in logistics, roads, and standard-bearers, nothing in the cursus honorum trained a man to govern legions balancing on mutiny. The mutiny on the Rhine reverberated in Rome, but not with immediate alarm. Tiberius, reigning from Capri and writing with guarded ambiguity, allowed Germanicus to bear responsibility. It was a test, the kind only emperors devised: distance without directive, silence as approval. Germanicus passed, but at cost. When he finally led the now quieted legions east beyond the Rhine into the territory of their old enemy Arminius, he did so with troops divided in soul, marching not for forum applause, but to keep the army too weary to mutiny again. And yet the root causes, distance, deployment, and divergence, remained. Auxiliary forces had watched the mutiny unfold with their own questions. How far did Roman prestige reach when even its core legions buckled? The Rhine flowed brown and slow that year, swollen by late summer rains, masking the scent of iron from quiet executions. Along its bends, grain followed troop lines, and rumors drifted just as swiftly. In the provinces east of the Rhine, the maps grew more uncertain. Scouting reports blurred tribal names. Settlements promised allegiance while sending sons to Arminius. Campaign season approached again, with paths plotted, rivers marked, and firewood stockpiled. But for Roman generals, the lines inked on parchment no longer mapped terrain alone. They measured morale, allegiance, and fracture. The next march would not just test the strength of Rome's arms, but whether her idea still held in frostbitten hearts. Off the coast of Euboea in 86 BCE, a Roman convoy tacked northward beneath cloud-racked skies. Sulla had secured Athens, but Mithridates' navy still prowled the Aegean, and every hull transporting grain, men, or coin was a gamble. Roman generals might command legions, but they did not command the weather. Neptune, indifferent to campaign plans, was a silent strategist in every expedition. Naval deployment was essential to long-distance campaigns. Armies required wheat, olive oil, and fodder in tonnage, a scale that overland carts could not sustain beyond the limits of the Via. Strategists therefore hitched their fortunes to the Mediterranean's caprice. A fleet might carry 10,000 soldiers or enough barley to feed 3 legions for a month. But if a storm cut it from shore like the sudden Bora winds of the Adriatic, those legions starved in place or turned on local allies who would not, supply them. Roman control by sea was always conditional, contingent on calm waters and careful timing. Beyond logistics, fleets synchronized theaters of war. When Caesar crossed the straits into Epirus in 48 BCE during the civil conflict, with Pompey he did so with haste. His fleet, scrambling through Ionic squalls, landed only a segment of his army, roughly 20 cohorts. For days, he was isolated, outnumbered, disconnected, and reliant on perilous signals to lure reinforcements. Naval miscoordination here nearly forfeited the campaign. The sea did not care who held imperium. Making such crossings took not just triremes or merchant transports requisitioned under the lex navalis, but meticulous orchestration of winds, tides, and timing. Compared to roads and aqueducts, maritime planning was a realm of uncertainty. In 43 BCE, as the Second Triumvirate mobilized against Brutus and Cassius in the East, whole flotillas vanished in the Ionian fog. Officers marked ships lost to grounding, piracy, or sheer dispersion. Men who arrived in Africa or Crete with no orders, disconnected from command for weeks. War could be delayed not by legions lacking obedience, but by cutters lacking sails. On Rome's Atlantic fringe, vulnerability multiplied. In 43 CE, the invasion of Britannia under Emperor Claudius met more resistance from Neptune than from the island's native tribes. Ships clustered near the Kentish coast as the channel's racked tides broke them apart. The Classis Britannica suffered losses by hazard, not battle. Those who made landfall trudged through sodden fens. Their armor soaked, their horses panicked by salt spray and cold. The general Aulus Plautius had planned overland lines from captured ports, but terrain and timing rendered many untenable. For want of dry-footing, commanders lost not only pace, but initiative. Even disciplined fleets drilled and manned with contract sailors and pressed marines found themselves helpless when torn from action by squalls. The Roman fleet at Mylae during the First Punic War, superior in construction and command, still found its proud Corvus-equipped ships drifting helplessly when the Tyrrhenian turned violent. In storm, centuries were not disciplined battalions. They were ballast shackled below decks in stinking dark. Oars snapped like bones, hulls ran aground. The sea, unlike barbarian armies, left no prisoners. Rome adapted. Harbors like Ostia and Puteoli thrived not merely for commerce, but as naval bulwarks buffering against delay. Still, even Augustus, whose fleets patrolled from the Classis Ravenades to the Red Sea, could not insulate all campaigns. The disaster in Germany under Varus in 9 CE, though a land defeat, was worsened by the inability to supply or relieve survivors. The Elbe was no road without naval ingress, no Roman rescue moved in time. Naval failure also cracked morale. Soldiers stranded offshore, watching distant beacons flicker on unfamiliar coasts, lived in dread. Some anchorage sites reeked of wet rope and rot, with grain spoiling in holds and militiae vomiting from motion. Discipline did not thrive in drift. Without anchors or orders, mutiny stirred in the galleys. Romans built for war now shoved from battle by silence and swell. As the later empire strained under inflation and overstretched naval predictability weakened further. Storms off the African coast interrupted the Annona routes. No grain from Byzacena meant ration cuts from the Danube to Cologne. Emperors on the frontier, deprived of every sixth ship, trimmed both plans and promises to their men. A campaign begun in Cappadocia in spring could be aborted by equinoctial gales, collapsing the supply convoys near Cyprus. And still generals planned. They drew their itineraria, they launched their bids for glory across waters whose temperament no magistrate could legislate. For when armies failed, it was not always from use of steel, but for want of wind. East of Cyrenaica, marble warehouses stood half-filled, their grain never retrieved. Dust gathered on amphorae lashed aboard empty hulls. Somewhere beyond sight, a fleet drifted, prey to tide and guesswork. And back on land, the legions waited, hungry and unnalled. The storm had not passed. In 55 BCE, as Julius Caesar prepared to cross the English Channel from Gaul, his plans halted, not for weather or rebels, but for birds. The augurs had examined the entrails of sacrificed animals and reported distorted livers, a twisted gall bladder, classical signs of divine displeasure. The legions waded ashore, armor polished and vessels caulked, yet no oar touched the sea. To defy the gods by proceeding would be not mere irreverence. It would be impietas, a contagious offense that stained commanders and cursed outcomes. For Roman generals, the gods did not merely inspire courage or console loss. They were agents of consent. No campaign began without auspicia, the interpretive ritual of observing the flight of birds, the behavior of sacred chickens, or the steaming organs of bulls. From the chaotic swirl of feathers or the silence of a raven, augurs extracted approval or forbiddance. These were not optional gestures. The Senate might grant imperium, but the animating will behind movement was divine. To march against unfavorable omens was to risk both military failure and political disgrace. The rituals carried weight not only because they were ancient, but because they were public. Omens were read before the legions and often, critically, before rival senators or potential successors. A commander who delayed under orders from the gods might appear pious in one, telling weak in another. Whispers began to circulate. Was the proconsul stalling because of unfavorable portents, or because he feared ambush, lacked logistics, or had lost the confidence of his men? In the Republic, such narrative shifts could erode authority faster than a rooted cohort. Even emperors treaded carefully. In 69 CE, during the year of the four emperors, Vitellius postponed an assault due to thunder interpreted as a heavenly rebuke. His rival Otho seized the moment, claiming divine favor and gathering disgruntled factions to his banners. The interpretation of omens was never neutral. Every priest had clients, every augur friends among the equites. When Marcellus in Hispania hesitated to attack a Lusitanian hill fort based on unfavorable auguries, his legate moved forward regardless and was killed. The event was later cited in the Senate not as a tactical blunder, but as a breach of Mos Maiorum tradition's sacred fabric. Some generals responded with theater. Sulla, campaigning against Mithridates, once repeated the sacrificial rites daily until favorable signs finally emerged. Whether this symbolized divine patience or mortal manipulation depended on the teller. Others bypassed the official methods. Lucullus is said to have trusted his personal haruspics over the designated augurs provided by the Senate, a subtle but perilous rejection of institutional religion. The boundary between strategy and sacrilege in such moments was razor-thin. The rituals also served practical constraints. They could delay a campaign long enough for reinforcements to arrive or offer a public excuse to avoid a risky engagement. But the cost of delay was heavy. In Gaul, mobilizing for spring campaigns required calculations bound to both the calendar and the harvest. Troops stationed near Vindonissa or Augusta Treverorum could not remain idle for weeks without draining their supply depots. Grain from the Annona could not be rediverted remotely at will. One day's postponement under divine warning might mean a week's delay in reaching the next river crossing, particularly when roads dissolved into flooded pastures, or when Dacian scouts learned of Roman hesitations and rallied harder. The moral weight of the gods clashed with Rome's most unforgiving economy time. Political opportunity, especially in the late Republic, was fragile. As proconsuls like Crassus or Pompey gathered wealth and fame abroad, envy rippled through the forum. If a peer's campaign stalled under sacred pretext, applause turned to laughter. When campaigns wavered, ambitious tribunes and rival consulars in Rome could circulate accusations that one had lost favor with Jupiter Optimus Maximus, or worse, that omens had been fabricated. In this religious consultation was not only a military procedure, it was a battlefield of reputations. No discipline, however brutal, could silence a legion that feared the gods had abandoned them. On occasion, entire maniples refused to cross rivers or descend into ravines deemed cursed. After Teutoburg in 9 CE, where Publius Quinctilius Varus lost 3 legion survivors swore that birds had called warnings unheeded. Whether true or retrospective, the belief itself festered as fact. Bad fate betrayed by neglected gods became a pattern hard to correct. And so generals stood divided between two hesitations, the delay enforced by ritual and the dread stirred by delay. As festivals approached or unsettling eclipses masked the moon, entire campaigns froze. A single black bird seen circling the Aquilifer's standard might unmake a spring offensive. Yet to linger too long invited whispers from Rome, from the camps, from the temples themselves. Somewhere beyond the border, enemy eyes watched the stalling eagles, and soon they would advance. The Danubian plain was quiet. A low wind bent the grasses, and the gray ribbon of the Ister, Rome's Danuvius, cut eastward toward the Black Sea. To the north, beyond the marshes and winter-thin forests, the Roxolani horsemen watched silent on the ridgeline. They were a known enemy, but they weren't the true danger now. Not since the emperor's last letter had arrived, its seal slashed open in the commander's tent, as the legionaries sharpened their spathi and tested the thickness of their winter cloaks. The ink was fresh, but the hand that penned it belonged to neither Senate nor Caesar. It bore accusation. False or real, it scarcely mattered. For a Roman general in the 260 CE, death could ride not on arrowheads, but in the handwriting of a rival. By the 3rd century, every campaign was a contest of blades and of rank. The general on the border did not solely face the mounted charges of northern tribes, nor the sudden lashes of Gothic raids crossing the frozen Danube at dawn. He faced the suspicion of the Praetoriani, the ambitions of provincial governors, and the whispering absentee hands of the Senate, shrunken in authority, yet still venomous when provoked. Imperium here meant more than command over troops. It meant navigating the jealousy of peers, the disbelief of Rome, and the fragile knowledge that any victorious march could be reframed as overreach once the wrong men returned to Rome before him. The armies Rome sent to guard its northeastern frontiers were massive, 30,000 in some campaigns, with more marching behind. But unlike the Republic's well-ordered consular armies, these men served not merely as tools of statecraft, but as kingmakers. Legions along the Danube had by now made and unmade emperors, from Decius to Gallienus. Veterans remembered Aemilian's rise, how he took imperial purple on the strength of frontier victories, only to be killed within weeks by his own men, once rumors reached Rome of a more legitimate successor. From within the marching camps, Castra Hiberna winter quarters dug deep into frost-hard soil, generals organized both logistics and letters. One grain shortfall could trigger unrest, one poorly timed missive could fracture loyalty. The annona militaris meant to feed the troops often failed in these remote zones. When it did, generals were forced into unsanctioned local levies, or the dangerous confiscation of allied harvests, breeding resentment that spilled across borders. In those plains filled with the low cry of nocturnal birds and the chill scent of distant smoke, no act went unnoticed. Allies might record insults and enemies would remember weakness. The real challenge was not merely prosecuting war, it was predicting betrayal. Philosophical rhetoric about law and duty had long given way to a darker calculus: how many units would remain loyal if the parens patriae died? How far could a commander advance before his own rear guard became a liability? Reports from Rome traveled along uncertain lines, corrupted by delay or design. A wax tablet might speak of promotion one day and exile the next, especially if forged by hands in the Palladium seeking to test devotion or trigger failure. This made campaigning paradoxical. To succeed on the battlefield was necessary, but to win too swiftly, too independently, was dangerous. Glory without sanction smacked of usurpation. And while the general listened for the music of Roxolani horns or the gallop of hooves through wet soil, his attendants listened for a quieter threat: the courier's knock at night, the sudden presence of aides from another legion flanking the camp under imperial pretext. Even within the general's own praetorium, loyalty was neither fixed nor assured. Promotions to tribunus or primus pilus were offered with caution. Too much favor shown to one centurion could birth resentment in another, and the general, sleeping in a tent that smelled of damp leather and long-used parchment, scarcely dreamed in peace. He awoke to scribe reports not just in military terms but in political caution. One misstep, a raid gone unsanctioned, a camp moved too quickly without Senate update, and charges of tyranny would descend. The Roxolani would ride again, that much was certain. Their archers knew Roman formations well by now, their chiefs having observed Roman skirmish lines season after season through half-trusted interpreters and wounded prisoners. Yet the greater mystery was not when their bows would bend, but from whom the next directive would come: Rome, Pergamum, Lugdunum, or somewhere worse. And as storm clouds gathered westward, obscuring the grain convoys and the messengers trudging through provincial mud, the general's dilemma sharpened. To hold the line might win him honor. To retreat could cost him Rome's confidence. But to win too greatly, without the right name behind him, might be the blade that slid between his ribs before spring thaw arrived. Something moved on the horizon. Not an enemy formation, but smoke. Perhaps Roman, perhaps not. The line between friend and foe had blurred. And more importantly, so had the line between conqueror and traitor. In the late 3rd century CE, the boundaries between campaign map and imperial edict began to blur. Rome's emperors no longer rose from the Senate steps or the rostra, they emerged from the bulwark of the legion armored in command, rather than eloquence. Aurelian rode from the Danubian front with dust on his boots and imperium in hand. Diocletian, hailed on the field in Nicomedia in 284, did not inherit rule. He took its sword first. Campaign planning was no longer a prelude to politics. It was politics, and each march risked transforming the state into a single man's ambition measured in grain, discipline, and gold. To direct such campaigns, a Roman general relied first on terrain, not terror. The itinerarium, his hand-drawn map, was layered with more caution than confidence. Tributaries tracked in faded ink, tribal boundaries guessed from half-told treaties, and markers for granaries mapped further apart than memory claimed. What looked like certainty across the parchment surface was often only a framework for improvisation. Past the last milestone of a Roman road, ignorance veiled the empire's edges. Scouts returned not only with intelligence but with contradiction, and always too late. Against this uncertain geography, strategy depended on the machinery of movement. Rome's armies did not simply march, they were sustained by the annona. This vast state provision network fed legions with grain, oil, wine, and salt. A single legion of 50 required nearly 30 modi of wheat a month. If shipments delayed or harvests in Africa failed, the consequence was not just hunger, it was stasis. A stalled march opened the door to mutiny or desertion, often blamed on unreliable allied cities or rapacious provincial governors. Logistics became diplomacy, and resentment more than enemy spears endangered cohesion. Even formation on the field reflected this tension. Legions rarely fought alone. Auxiliary cohorts drawn from non-citizen populations, archers from Crete, cavalry from Numidia, slingers from the Balearics, filled the gaps. Their loyalty, sworn by treaty but stretched across culture, was harder to measure. Some auxiliaries defected mid-battle. Others demanded sacrificial captives or plunder before they advanced. Roman commanders, no matter how disciplined their legions, had to orchestrate these forces like a brittle alliance, part military, part negotiation. A crack in trust meant not just defeat but fragmentation. Within the castra, the Roman camp functioned as command community and crucible. Its rectilinear layout, the Cardo and Decumanus crossing at right angles, tents ranked by seniority, illustrated the invisible hierarchy that bound legionaries as firmly as any chain. Yet time wore at structure. Winters in the Rhine limes bred restlessness. In the barracks, men rolled dice, whispered recriminations, and recalled distant homelands. The silent patrol of the lictor carrying the fasces enforced discipline, but not always obedience. Punishments were swift decimation, flogging, demotion, but even order frays in the cold. In hostile terrain, even the best-ordered army risked ruin. Forest warfare exposed Rome's greatest vulnerability: overconfidence in roads and ranks. In 9 CE, Publius Quinctilius Varus marched 3 legions into the Teutoburg forest with rigid formation and antique assumptions, and emerged only as a cautionary tale. Trees swallowed discipline. Mud shattered columns. A general's greatest weapon, foresight, failed when the enemy knew the underbrush better than he did. The humiliation lingered not just in lost eagles, but in the shattered illusion of remotio hostium. And yet generals did not campaign for defense alone. War was capital. Plunder from a subdued city went first to the treasury, yes, but soldiers expected pay, and equites financiers, who had risked their fortune provisioning the advance, awaited their share. A commander chasing glory weighed every risk against coinage. When gold grew scarce, soldiers stalled. Discipline decayed into negotiation. Men demanded donativa, bonuses, before fighting, and some generals, desperate, paid their armies up front, mortgaging battles before swords left their scabbards. Thus military authority drifted decisively into civil dominion. When Augustus died and Tiberius lingered in uneasy transition, the Great Rhine Revolt of 14 CE exposed the raw undercurrent of the imperial system. Legions mutinied not out of rebellion, but expectation. They set terms: 20 years of service reduced to 16 immediate bonuses, legal immunity for acts under arms. Rome's facade of unity cracked, revealing that its armies were loyal not to Senatus Populusque Romanus, but to the voice that paid and led them. It was a loyalty more mercenary than mythic. Eventually, the division between general and emperor collapsed entirely. By the time Constantine crossed the Alps toward the Milvian Bridge, a campaign was a coronation by battle. Diocletian's reforms made this clearer still: the emperor was imperator in both name and function, a supreme military official whose court followed the camp standards, whose civil organs echoed military discipline. The frontier was not at the edge of the empire, it was wherever he marched. In such a world, opposing the emperor was indistinguishable from declaring war. But when power was borne solely by the sword's edge, survival became unstable. Each campaign raised the same question: was the general fighting for Rome, or becoming it? A victory might secure order, or incite rival legates to declare imperium in another province. The margins between defense ambition and usurpation wore thin. There was no map for such moments. And even as generals stood triumphant on provincial plains somewhere behind them, the North African grain roads stretched unguarded. Somewhere to the east, a rider watched the supply columns and waited for the chain to break. In the dusk of empire, maps no longer guaranteed control. Rome's generals, once the architects of expansion, now traced their campaigns not across new provinces, but across fading corridors of survival. The Annona Rome system of grain distribution had not collapsed, but it groaned. The vast fleets, once heavy with African wheat, faltered as pirate lords, Gothic horsemen, and unpaid sailors circled the sea lanes from Carthage to Ostia. What began as a trickle of missed rations became famine in armor. The general no longer looked first to the standard or the enemy line. He looked to the docks. The old rhythms of Roman war, marshal the legion's march with purpose, offer battle, now bent to a single uncertainty: food. Morale could withstand enemy banners on the horizon, but not the meager crunch of spoiled biscuit. Too many generals in the 3rd and 4th centuries had learned the same lesson along different frontiers: a soldier without bread is a soldier without oath. In Numidia and Byzacna, fields once golden with harvest fed not Rome but its enemies. Berber raiders, unbound by treaty or tax, struck at storehouses and grain convoys. Once a minor nuisance, now they operated with cavalry sharp and fast, disrupting transport before it reached the coast. Rome's control depended not just on territorial garrisons, but on uninterrupted movement. And when roads to Hadrumetum or Leptis turned unsafe, the entire supply scheme across Mare Nostrum convulsed. The Gothic cavalry learned quickly. In Thrace and Dacia, they had seen how few guards watched the grain roads. A single fast-moving band, 10 to 15 riders, could outpace a cohort, torch a convoy, vanish. It wasn't battlefield warfare. It was economic strangulation. And the legions far forward along the Rhine or Danube waited. They waited for food that never came. When the Rhine froze and barges could not pass, desperation turned the axe inward. Camp prefects tried discipline, floggings, reductions in salt rations, a double round of drills. But discipline is ballast, not fuel. Some centurions begged city governors for local tribute, pushing even friendly civitates near revolt. Others turned to foraging parties deep in enemy woods where one misstep could mean ambush. The ground was no longer Rome's. The forest line watched back, so generals hedged. They cut campaigns short. Tiridates Aureolus Florian, names etched more in retreat than conquest. They swerved when they could not feed their men, circled instead of pressing. The auxilia, once the shock force of Rome's border strategy, grew restless. These were not citizens bound by mos maiorum or Roman pride. These were Dalmatians, Mosians, Gauls, who had joined for loot pay or treaty obligation. And when payment halted, some fled. Others negotiated, offering to remain but at cost. The strain reached outward. Imperial war chests, drained by previous attempts to placate mutinous troops, had less to offer. A general could no longer promise land after discharge or gold in the saddlebag. What he could offer was uncertain victory, delayed bounty, and frozen roads. On more than one occasion, north of Augusta, Treverorum west of Serdica, entire centuries refused to march, their banners lowered not in shame but protest. And yet the Senate could not ignore the East. Persia loomed. Armenia quivered on the fault line. The grain stopped flowing west, the Eastern Legion still moved, fighting Shapor's armies swift and brutal. This divergence of theaters from the Rhine's hunger to the Tigris's bloodletting stretched Rome's capacity beyond its old imperial rhythm. Generals no longer relied on just maps. They relied on favorable storms, on tribal loyalties held by silver chains, on divine auguries that might turn again. And when famine marched faster than infantry, armies disbanded in place. Castra became settlements. Some troops, unpaid and unresupplied, took wives from local villages and never returned. Others roamed as mercenaries, offering their arms to rival claimants, or even to the same tribes they once subdued. The boundary between Roman force and foreign threat blurred not at the front but within the ranks. The imperium still existed. Rome still named consuls, debated edicts, struck coins bearing imperial faces. But each campaign brought with it the risk of crippling withdrawal. Not every battle need be lost. A lost convoy could suffice. And as the horsemen watched the grain roads, the arcs of empire held, but just. Spring promised little. The fields lay scorched or abandoned. The Rhine ice thinned. The wind shifted back toward Africa. But those roads were no longer Roman, not entirely. Spring 58 BCE, near the Rhone, crossing in Gallia Narbonensis, Julius Caesar's legions faced the Helvetii migration, over 250 bodies straining Roman grain lines. Marshland stinks of trampled earth and trodden dung as legionaries erect castra on sodden ground. Standard-bearers wait at dusk beneath flapping vexilla, listening for orders that might split forces or commit all. With the Senate's backing secured, imperium alone won't protect them. Caesar must stretch the annona and secure loyalty from volatile auxilia while maneuvering in enemy terrain. He drafts plans not only for battle, but for supply, morale, and Roman prestige. One misstep here and command could bleed into disaster. Before blades were unsheathed or horses saddled, the Roman general unfolded parchment. Campaigns began not with violence but with vision. Lines inked across membrana, rough brown lines, tracing rivers, roadways, and supply posts, where knowledge thinned beyond the last legionary mile marker. These were not modern maps in any precise sense, but itineraria, chains of destinations, estimated distances, and uncertain frontiers. They revealed more ambition than certainty. Granaries were marked with symbols, tribal boundaries, barely sketched guesses, mountains, or sometimes omitted altogether. Beyond the lines, rumor outpaced reconnaissance. Yet logistics demanded more than imagination. A general in Gaul or Illyricum required not just valor but foresight. He needed to know whether 40,000 men could march over weeks without local grain failing or rivers choking their route. The map's purpose was to bind geography to Rome's will. But even the most seasoned commander knew that roads turned to swamps after spring floods, and that scouts spoke more dialects than truths. Detailed intelligence was rare, misdirection commonplace. In the East, entire campaigns had collapsed when wrong turns sent legions into terrain no map acknowledged. Planning war meant speaking two languages at once, military and senatorial. Even with imperium granted by the Senate or people, generals seldom marched freely. Lucullus in the East, Caesar in Gaul, both operated under political scrutiny that followed them via letter and rumor. Each direction taken became a wager. Should Rome's Senate turn its attention to Egypt's grain yields or Parthia's border raids, a general's support could vanish overnight. Campaigning was a fraught performance where auctoritas was earned through both victory and visibility, and could be revoked by policy or jealousy.